80s golden age of comedy. I'm your host, Bruce Starr, and I'm again thrilled to bring you another show that talks about the amazing golden age of comedy in the 80s. And for me, I was living out in Hollywood, so for me, it was the improvisation on Melrose and on occasion the Comedy Store on Sunset. But being almost innocently in the middle of that incredible outburst of energy and talent and television and success of people that were originally just friends. We would sit around the improv and talk and chat, and I'd go in and watch them inside, and they'd come off. My next buddy would go in and watch them, and I'm watching these guys and learning from them. And then evening at the improv hits, and wow, all of a sudden we went from being a sleepy improv to cameras and action and Milton Berle and Phyllis Diller and Jackie Mason and you name it. These people came there and were hosts to the show. And it was just amazing to see these people introducing the newest acts, the most able and skilled comedians of our time. And there were many variables that had to do with the whole picture. You certainly had the comedians, you had Bud Friedman, and you had Mark Linnell, and you had producers who were coming and looking for talent. You had agents who were there sitting with talent and looking for more talent. You had managers, the same thing, casting directors, talent scouts. It was such an exciting time, and I'm thrilled that I was a part of it. So I was a personal appearance agent, and I got lucky. I'll be the first one to tell you that when the comedy clubs exploded, the agents, I wasn't even an agent at that time. The comedians didn't want to make the calls to the comedy clubs that were exploding all over the country, and their agents, William Morris, ICM, it was too small a gig for them to spend their time getting people $2,000 or $3,000 weekend gigs for Howie Mandel or the Unknown Comic. So my roommate, Barry Marter, said, why don't they like you? They seem to trust you. Why don't you ask them if you can make those calls for them? And that's what happened. And that's how I became a personal appearance agent. I actually ended up with 35 at one point stand-up comedians from Howie Mandel, the Unknown Comic, Paul Reiser, Bobby Slayton, you name it. I was representing a lot of incredible guys. And then I was dealing with comedy clubs and comedy promoters and producers all around the country. And when I came across Jeff Penn, I knew he was a good guy because all the comedians that I'm friends with, if you go on their Facebook, there shows up Jeff Penn. There's Jeff Penn. I go to another guy's page. There's Jeff Penn. So there must be something about this guy, Jeff Penn, that I'm going to find out all about. Jeff, welcome to the 80s golden age of comedy. I'm glad to have you on the show.
Thank you. And I am just as thrilled. I'm thrilled to be here. And I'm just as thrilled to have been part of that 80s explosion of comedy as you were. I mean, it really was an opportunity that happened by happenstance. And I think, I think we all feel that we're lucky to have been at the right place at the right time for us to have been able to be part of this, for sure.
So tell me about your childhood. Did your childhood at all have anything to do with getting into comedy?
I think it did. For a couple of reasons. Number one, I was never one of the popular kids. I wasn't athletic, and I found that by making my friends laugh, making others laugh, doing crazy things in and around the classroom, the class clown thing, that worked for me. And so I was kind of the practical joker. I mean, of course, today, if anybody did half the things I did when I was in high school, if I did it today, I'd be in jail for life. No doubt. It's like, there's no room, zero tolerance. There's no room for some of the things that we did. And that's sad too, because that was, I had an interesting childhood for that reason. And in addition to my doing that, I think part of that came from my father being kind of a little bit of a clown himself. He was a big Broadway aficionado, and he loved comedians. He loved comedians so much that he would play the albums. He would play Alan Sherman. He would play Belle Barth. He would play Alan King, and I would hear that as a kid. And then when the music fair, you'll probably remember the music fair experience, Westbury in New York, the theaters in the round.
Oh yeah.
At one time, they were all tents. They were summer tents. And he would take me, my mother, my father, myself, we'd go to these tents when I was 13, 14, 15 and see Buddy Hackett, or see people like that. And Alan King, I saw a few times that way. And I just appreciated comedy. I appreciated being around comedians. So yeah, so as far as my childhood goes, I was always exposed to it. Never thought I'd be part of it, either as an industry or as a fan specifically geared to the industry. I just always thought of it as, oh, I like watching them on TV. I like watching the Tonight Show. There was always that 11:30 when I was 13 or 14 where, you'd sneak the TV on so you could see Johnny. I had a little TV, a little black and white 12-inch in my room. Used to watch the Tonight Show. Love the monologues that Johnny did. Love the comedians. Again, one of my favorite things. Same thing with the Sullivan Show. We all watched that stuff as kids. And I think it just affected some of us more than others. And for me, it just gave me a sense of loving life because I like being funny. I like to see other people being funny, and it worked. Never thought that I would get into it at all. And then I got into college, University of Maryland, which is really the beginning for me. I was a radio, television, and film major. And I guess you can tell by my voice, I have a little bit of a radio voice. And so I had already done professional radio, even as a 16 and 17-year-old in the Washington, D.C. market. So I was a radio, TV, film major. I went to the Maryland radio station, University of Maryland, with a bit of an attitude and a bit of an ego. And I walked in and I'm like, well, where's my show? Where's my show? And they're like, get in line, sign up. The first thing you're going to be doing is you're going to be sweeping up on weekends, and then you'll be, ripping and putting the news together. I'm like, no, I've done commercial radio. So I left, and I thought, well, I want to do something at the school. You know what? The program board, at that time called the program board, were the producers of concerts. And I thought, well, I'll get involved in that. And I did. And so I was, basically working as a production assistant with the school on helping to put together our concerts, our large events. Again, not all comedy, mostly music, some very large arena events, because we had that arena at the University of Maryland in Cole Fieldhouse. And, but I also learned a little bit of the backstage part of the business, which I enjoyed a great deal. Cool. And without getting into all of the history of it, within about a year, the school, in their brilliance, had let go the two people, or one of them actually quit. I think they let go the other person who ran the program board, the faculty members. And they never thought to rehire anybody. So a few of us showed up in August and were like, where's our advisor? And they're like, oh, I don't know. I'm sure they'll be here. Well, nobody ever showed up, but we had a budget. We had money. So we took that. Yeah, I know. And we took that money, just students. We took that money and we began to produce our own concerts. So for a full year, we were unsupervised. Actually, it went on for 2, but that's another story. And I decided that since I love comedy so much, I'll be the guy who puts together the comedy events. So, that was the time for me to put together, Steve Martin and Robert Klein and people of that nature, and just loved it. So that was my first attempt, or wasn't an attempt, it was successful. My first foray into producing comedy events.
Wow, sounds great. Sounds great. So you kind of got yourself some experience in college when other kids were getting high and drinking.
Oh, don't get me wrong. I mean, we were getting high and drinking.
Okay, but
don't just give that to the other kids. No.
But by the time you graduated, you had an incredible amount of working experience that you could take anywhere you wanted to go. Where did you go with it?
Well, here's the unique thing, and it was kind of interesting. I credit my wife, then girlfriend, who was also on the program board with me, and she was in charge of cultural events, like bringing the Korean masked dancers over from Korea to perform for the
Nice,
first time in
nice.
the US. So one day she's in one of her agency catalogs. As you know, people might not know this since we have the internet, and I don't know, we have to go back to our age to remember that there were actually things called printed catalogs that agencies sent out,
Hmm.
and material. It was actually hard copy. So she was going through one of these huge books of cultural events, and she came across something called Catch a Rising Star on Tour.
Ah,
And she said to me, I think this is from Catch a Rising Star in New York. And I said, nah, probably not. It's in a cultural book. That's all, ballet and orchestra. And she goes, no, no, I really think it is. I said, well, that's not the same logo or anything. And then I started looking at it and I'm reading it and it's like, yeah, Catch a Rising Star, Rick Newman, partnered with a company called the National Theater Company at the time, who were Broadway producers. And they put together a package that was called Catch a Rising Star on Tour, where they would send to a college 2 comedians from Catch, a singer from Catch, and a piano player. And the 2 comedians, one would act as the host, the other would just be a regular featured comedian. Singer would sing about 15 minutes. And then we were supposed to audition at the school and find 2 or 3 people that wanted to do stand up, put them on the show and add them to the show. Well,
wow.
so we started booking the show in one of the little cabaret rooms that we had on campus. And the first time we had the show, it was Richard Belzer
Whew.
and Robert Wool and
Wow.
a singer, very, nobody knows the singers, an unknown singer named Pat Benatar,
Ah, yep.
referring to actually we referred to her back then as Patty Benatar,
Hmm.
and a piano player. Oh, the show was amazing, and we had it back again a couple of times, few times, and I mean we had great people. We had Bob Shaw, Larry Ragland, again Bells. David Say was on those tours, and they were great. So I had that experience. So as I was ready to graduate, National Theater Company came to me and they said, "Would you like to represent this?" Because I was going to be going to an agency, a local small agency. Would you like to represent this to colleges, maybe in a larger, a region? And I said, yeah, I could sell this because it's an easy show to sell. I mean, I love it. I know the show. So I took that on and I actually did that for a year as I was getting my feet wet, working for a local band agency here and trying to incorporate comedy into their programming. So that started me out there. Then in 1979, January, a club opened in Washington. I had nothing to do with the opening. It was called Garvin's, and it was a
Sure.
little, yeah, a
Right.
little room in Washington, D.C. that was a restaurant right across from the 2 biggest convention hotels. And a woman had brought the concept to them that, hey, we can bring people down from New York. We'll pay for their train. We'll give them a couple $100 and they'll come in and do 4 shows on the weekend. And that's how that started. I got involved about 6 months in, because first I started going to the shows when I found out, got to know the owner, got involved. 6 months in, I took over as the show announcer essentially and helping to seat people. And about a year and a half in, after going through a couple of different changes in booking, he said, "Do you want to take over the booking?" Well, by then I knew all the comedians, all the people who had come through. We all got to be friends because we were hanging out, we were all partying. The club scene, the club scene was amazing back then. It wasn't just people performing in audiences. I mean, there were mentor-mentee relationships that formed, local people who were just starting out, watching comedians, getting to learn from them. And then there were the people like us who were in the nightclub business, and all of a sudden it was quite unique. I mean, so knowing the people like Paul Reiser, Seinfeld, Larry Miller, Adrian Tolsch, Bill Sheft, Rich Jenny. I mean, I can go through the Bill Maher, go through the whole list of the people who were regulars for us. And I took over the booking in late 1980, early 81. So that really is the start for me.
Wow. So there's a good chance that I probably made calls to you to book some of my Hollywood comedians.
I know you probably did. And honestly, it was funny because of our budget. The owner kept a very tight budget on things that for the first, up until 1983, we did get calls. And I'm sure you were probably one of the calls. We used to get calls from, all the major agencies, the minor agencies. Spotlight was one of the calls I remember getting all the time. But we couldn't afford to do people, and we weren't, we could, but the owner was keeping it again as a tight budget. So most of our talent was coming almost exclusively from New York. The only time we broke into LA, because we really didn't do travels, when people were already in New York, and we'd still cover their train down, their hotel, and we used a first class hotel. It was great. It was a great experience. In 1983, I flew out to Los Angeles, along with the owner of the Comedy Works in Philadelphia, Steve Young.
Yeah,
And
I know Steve. He did a
yeah,
show.
yeah, well, I love Steve. I've known Steve for all those years. And another guy who ran the East Coast Comedy Club in New York, the booking, Rick Messina, and of course,
Yeah, I
Rick.
know Rick. Sure.
Yeah, the three of us came out together, and we were on what we would call a quote unquote buying trip, where we would bring people out from LA to do all three clubs. They do DC, Philly, and New York. And that worked. We came up with a number of people that we could pool and do a 3-week tour, split the expenses. And it was great. And then, of course, there were people that would fill in the one-nighters like Jerry Stanley in New York, or the guys in Pittsburgh. They all had a network of one-nighters. So when we weren't doing the weekends, there were places that people could work if we weren't able to just put them up. So we put together a couple of really nice little tours.
Excellent, excellent. So you're building an incredible foundation, as far as I can see. What went on after that?
Well, we had many good years. This was 1979 when Garvin started. It was really the beginning. It was New York. I don't even think Philly had quite opened then. It was LA. It was Detroit had the Comedy Castle, I believe. Chicago, of course, had Second City. LA, and that's it. I mean, there were maybe 75 or 100 comedians working in the country doing those circuits.
Right.
And that boom took place in the 1980s when other major cities opened, and then all of a sudden minor cities opened. By 1983, 84, as you know, almost every city in the country had a comedy club. And because they needed talent, there were lots of new comedians coming up. And it was a great time, because between 1983 and say 1990, it was probably the biggest part of show business that there was. I mean, because there was so much to do, so many opportunities, and of course, people moving out to LA to try to get breaks on sitcoms. Everybody's still looking for the elusive Tonight Show or Letterman spot. Those were really the only two major shows. I mean, people were still doing a Merv Griffin here or a thing like that, but the two shows that made a difference were Letterman and Carson.
So did you remember any of the guys, girls that came down that didn't just come and go, that you connected with, that you become friends with, that
Oh yeah, well,
some fun stories that you can share with us?
it was hard not to become friends with people, because most of them, and I say this, most of the comedians that were coming down, were doing the circuit, were incredibly friendly. They wanted to party, they wanted to have fun, and it wasn't so much a management employee relationship. I mean, with clubs, as you know, this was just a group of people. We were all around the same age group. We were all into the same things, and we made it fun for the audience because we were having fun. If we were having fun running the shows, the audience was having fun. Comics were having fun, and I don't think people back then went to a comedy club to see comedians. They went to a comedy club for the entire experience of walking in, getting seated, not knowing what could happen that night or who could drop in, and like in LA, I mean, we were DC, so we didn't have a lot of celebrities that were based in DC. So, I mean, when Rodney would come in, was in town for a presidential thing, a White House thing, he would drop in. Mark Russell would drop in occasionally. We had the whole cast of NBC's Real People came in once, Byron Allen, Skip Stevenson, and those things were fun because the audience was seeing now, all of a sudden people were dropping in that they recognized from TV. A lot of great experiences like that. We actually, you may remember a movie, fairly obscure, but I always tell people about it. DC Cab.
I didn't see it, but certainly heard of it.
It's worth seeing, especially now. You would love it because I'm trying to remember the whole cast. I think I may have it written down somewhere, but it was a film that essentially starred Gary Busey and Mr. T, and the support staff. It was all about a kind of a rogue cab company in Washington, and I mean, it was Paul Rodriguez, Bill Maher, Marsha Warfield. I don't know if you knew Charlie Barnett, who was an incredible street comic from New York City.
Right. I didn't know much about him, but I certainly know
Yeah.
the name.
Irene Cara, Whitman Mayo from Sanford and Son. So they would come into our club every. I mean, we didn't have comedy every night. We did it on Fridays and Saturdays, and we did a mixed amateur pro show on Thursday. But they come in every night anyway, just to hang out. And we had impromptu shows that would go on Monday through Friday for 3 weeks, where they would all come in and just take over the stage. It was incredible. I mean, I remember one night, the Buddy Holly story was actually on TV, and they came in. Of course, we had TVs on, and Busey was there, and there were people there, and just eating in the restaurant. And he said, "Hey, there's a piano on stage. Let's have some fun." So he went up on stage, and before you knew it, we had everybody on stage singing and carrying on with Busey, and we were pretty much doing the Buddy Holly story live.
Wow.
And it was totally unplanned. Something that you would never have expected, and it was really something amazing. And that's what it was like back then. And for me, the excitement of being around and being part of, just observing is more or less being a part of it. It was amazing. And people I developed relationships with, which was your first question. I mean, I developed a long standing friendship with Jay Leno because, we had him coming in '83 and '84, and he was just one of those guys you just, got along with.
Great guy.
Always.
I hope we'll do the show one of these days.
Yeah, actually, if I were, and I say this to friends, I say, people go, it's a shame Leno isn't hosting the Tonight Show anymore. And there were stories about Leno not booking a lot of stand-up comics. And, I think Jay more or less left that to the producers. He didn't want to get into it because he had too many friends. And if he got into it, it would create problems. I got to say, I kind of understand his situation. And it's difficult because, you want to have people on, but, he had just too many friends. It was hard. I would say the better opportunity now and the more fun opportunity is to get into Jay's show on CNBC, to do the Jay's Garage, because that is a blast. And I have never seen anyone more at home and more relaxed and just having more fun than Jay in his garage. I've watched the show. I've been to the garage. I mean, it's just a blast. And that show is a lot of fun. So it's, a little about cars, but it's about Jay. It's about comedy.
And Seinfeld's got that same kind of show, driving with comedians with drinking coffee, whatever the name of that show is.
Well, leave it to Jerry Seinfeld, who is one of those people who can never sit still, which is good. Jerry was always, the last year Garvin's was open at the original location in Washington, he called me. It was probably June or July. And he said, "Listen, do you have New Year's Eve open?" And I said, "Well, we got tentative something. We haven't really planned it yet." He goes, "Listen, Larry Miller and I want to come back East. Can we do the show together on New Year's Eve?"
Oh my God.
So they gave me a price. I won't mention what it was. It was so ridiculously low. I mean, it was just, but it was more than we normally paid. I had to go to the owner. I had to kind of, "Come on, really? This is Jerry." And "Yeah, but they're not going to draw any more than anybody else." Jerry. So eventually he relented, and we paid what they were asking, which again was a ridiculously low amount. And we had an amazing New Year's Eve show, and that was in '83 going into '84. When his series was over and he was touring, and that's what he wanted to do. I mean, I remember Leno saying a long time ago that if the circumstances were ever such that someone came to him and said, "Would you rather do the Tonight Show or stand up?" he would have given up the Tonight Show in an instant. Because, and a lot of people know this, a lot of people don't, that when Jay was doing the Tonight Show, Sunday night, every week, he was in the Comedy and Magic Club in Hermosa Beach, working out, well, not just working out his material for the week on the monologues, but he would do a full hour show and then work stuff out. Then he'd go home, then he would do Monday through Friday on the Tonight Show. And Friday, when the taping was over, he would drive to, well, not much of a drive, but Burbank Airport, jump in a jet and go to wherever his corporate gig was.
Yep.
He would do it Friday.
The hardest working comedian. I tell the story in half the shows, but my memories of Jay was he would do a setup on Sunset at the Comedy Store, and he always had on a heavy leather jacket when he drove his motorcycle.
Right.
And anywhere that you were, if you weren't inside, anywhere that you were on the outside at the bar or eating, you heard a motorcycle drive up and he parks it right on the sidewalk, and he gets off. He's got this big, heavy leather jacket, and he goes through the hallway there and did his set. Always working, always working.
Yeah. I remember one night, this is just another story, on Melrose at the Improv. And it was a big deal because Robin Williams had dropped in. And so everybody, but Robin used to hang a bit too. So,
Oh,
and you know, he'd run around to other clubs. But that night when Robin had just come off, Jay, you hear the motorcycle outside. And Jay comes in with his helmet and the leather and everything. And he saw me because I was standing by the bar. And the first thing he said to me was, he looked at me and he looked at my wife and he said, "What are you guys, the Lucy and Ricky of comedy?" He said, "What are you doing?" I said, "We're on vacation." He goes, "Yeah, you taking a vacation in a comedy club?" You know, that was. So he said, "Come on, sit down." So we went to sit down in the bar. Well, Robin came over, sat down. Bud sat down.
Wow.
It was one of those nights where I'm sitting and I'm like, I'm sitting among comedy royalty here, but totally by accident. You know, it just turned out that way. Bill Maher was, yeah. So, but back to Jerry for a second. When Jerry came up with that, comedians in cars getting coffee, he just did it on the internet. I mean, he just went, I don't need anything. I'll just do it myself. And it was so incredibly good because it was so incredibly simple. And to this day, I mean, I've got my 3 or 4 favorites, but the one he did with Barack Obama, when President Obama was still in the White House, where he's knocking on the Oval Office window and they're driving around the driveway. That's still the best. I mean, it's just amazing.
My
Yeah,
roommate, I don't know if I lived with a guy when I was out there in the 80's, Barry Marter. I don't know if you know
I
that.
heard you mention that. Yeah.
And so Barry and I were roommates, I think, for 3, 4 years even. And
Mhm.
he did it. He did either 1 or 2 shows, coffee shows with Jerry. He and Jerry
Mhm.
are very close now, and he's Barry's such a talented and creative writer.
I
That
remember Barry from then. Yeah, 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 yeah. Barry was another one. In fact, there's a lot of names that kind of go in and out of my head if they're not, until somebody brings them up to me. I was just thinking of somebody the other day, Bruce Mahler, that I haven't heard from in a long time. Jeff Altman. It's
oh, I love
people.
Jeff.
Yeah. I mean, and we mentioned these names. We're talking about these names. We're talking about the golden age of comedy in the 1980s. And I can only say to people, if you didn't live through that, and we're mentioning these names and you don't know who they are, you got to find a club somewhere when this pandemic ends, or as I call it, the presidemic, because I think we've got to do something about this and not putting it on everybody. But as soon as this ends and people can get back to live entertainment, I think it's great that comedy has developed. It's great that time has passed, but some of the best talent I have ever seen came out of that era, and they're still out there, and a lot of them are still working, still trying to work. You may not know their names, but I'm going to tell you, these are the best, as you know, these are the best possible people. And I don't understand. I mean, I kind of do, why that didn't necessarily translate to some of the newer generations coming up. Because where I do find some of them very funny, I also find a lot of them, it's not a question of pushing an envelope anymore, or it's just some things just aren't funny. There's no structure. There's no, they don't have the innate internals to be funny. I don't know how to describe that.
I think that's a very, very good point. And from all the shows that I've done, and I'm almost at 30 shows here and counting. I mean, I'm doing 2 or 3 a week. So by the time another month goes by, there'll be a lot more shows. But what I'm learning is they cut their teeth in the 70's,
Hmm.
and they were really there for themselves in the 70's and early 80's, so
Hmm.
that they were coaching each other, they were there
That's it.
for each
Right.
other. And then when the TV stuff hit, that's when they were all so well focused and so professional by then that
Hmm.
when TV hit, there wasn't a, oh, should I do it? Can I do it? Can I handle it? They were all so good. They were there supporting each other. They were there for each other. It was a magical time.
Well, I see that now. In fact, I commented recently to somebody. We used to go to the bars. The shows would happen. The comics would be at the bars afterwards, and new comics. When Leno first worked for me in 1983, there were local comedians that came, and we had an open mic night on a Wednesday night, and Jay was in a day early, and he wandered over just to sit. And that time, he'll probably kill me, but that time he was smoking a pipe, and he used to walk around with his pipe, and it was great because if you remember Jay with a big black hair and the pipe, and and he sat down, and we were all talking, and he said, "Hey, you mind if I do a couple minutes?" And we're like, "Do we mind?" No. So he went up and he did like 10 minutes, and he got off. And he said, and we said, the audience loved you. He goes, "Yeah, I'm only doing 10 because it's not my night, it's their night. This is for these guys." And when those guys came off, what did Jay do? He went with everybody to a restaurant a few doors down and sat till 4 a.m. talking to the younger comedians about what they, why don't you try this? Why don't you try, this is, you're developing. He was a mentor but it wasn't just him. It was almost all of them. They would always go up to somebody else and say, "Listen, I caught this set, and try this instead of that. Try this line. This word may be funnier." As we all know, they're great words in comedy. Nowadays, and this is what I've seen, if you go up, if an established comedian comes up to a feature or an open micer or an MC in a club and say, I like that bit, but if you change this, they spit at him. I mean, they really do. I saw two guys once in a club. This was maybe 15 years ago. And a comic came over and gave a suggestion to one of them. And he went, "Oh, yeah, cool. Okay, great." And then when the comic walked away, the guy says to his friend, another comic, who does he think he is? What? Who does he think he is? Where? He's no celebrity. He's no big star. Like he's telling me how to do my act. That's what's happened. I mean, people no longer had the respect for those that came before them. And I guess that's the key word, the respect for, I mean, you and I have watched people from the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. Most of these people are only watching what they've seen on TV for the last 10 or 12 years.
Yeah.
And that's it. That's all they can equate to.
It would be like the 80s guys not paying any attention at all to Laurel and Hardy, or
Right.
thinking Groucho was stupid,
Mm-hmm.
or not paying any attention to the power of the Three Stooges, or some of the other guys that you mentioned that were Alan King. I mean, Robert Klein.
George Kirby. And I always bring up George Kirby because I always say, and people talk about black comedians, and people forget somebody like Nipsey Russell, George Kirby, some of these great guys that were back in that era. And yeah, we watched them. I mean, we watched them do stand up. They were amazing.
And I really don't know anything about modern day comedians because I don't have any interest at all. When I initially left the business and I'd go sit at a comedy club, after watching the guys I represented and going to a local comedy club, it was like, oh my God, let me out of here.
Yeah.
And I think, though, that if they don't have that camaraderie, which I could see, they're all in it for themselves. I'm just guessing.
Mm-hmm.
They're missing that structure, the teaching, the lessons that needed to be learned to be comedians that can last for decades and not just for a year or two.
Well, I've never been a fan for a long time. I really was not happy with what I call comedy schools. And, a lot of places have them, and a lot of comedians, have their coaching and whatever. And coaching is a little different than we're having classes to learn how to do comedy, and anybody can write and perform, because I don't believe that's true. But I think there are classes. They're just not classes. There are ways to learn. The years that people worked out in the comedy clubs was the same as college, was the same as trade school, because you didn't just go and do your set and run away. You went in, you did your set, you watched others do their sets, you talked to each other, you learned. That was a classroom experience. So I really think that the school was kind of informal, depending on who's teaching a school nowadays for writing jokes. And, because you can teach formula jokes, you can teach certain things. You can't teach, again, the internals. What makes someone funny? We call it delivery. And of course, that's how it is delivered. But sometimes it's something inside that affects the delivery, not just the way it's enunciated, the way it's pronounced, the way it's put out there. And I've said this to people who always complain about, jokes being stolen. Somebody will say, I heard so-and-so was doing my joke about peanut butter and the raisins. And I'll go, that's horrible because you don't want anybody to steal material. But you know what? It's so funny when you do it. Nobody does it like you. It's your joke. Everybody knows it's your joke because you make it come alive. I've seen other people do something that they just can't make it work.
Very good point. I like that a lot.
That's why writing for themselves, and I always say, you don't, it's one thing if somebody gives you some contribution, but it's important to write for yourselves because you're writing from what comes inside. You know how to make what you're talking about funny. And writing jokes for someone else, if you know them really well, you can do that because you have to learn where they're coming from. And that's what's great about a good writer for somebody else. But as a stand-up goes, I mean, if the majority of your material isn't coming from you, then it's not going to work, and I tell people that all the time. Find your persona. And I'll always say to a comedian who's working, don't come in the second week or the third week and be depressed because you have 3 bad weeks, 3 bad sets. It's going to take you a while to get it. If you've got something, and usually we can see it, we can see somebody who's coming in and just rehearsing and they're not funny. They just don't, there's nothing there. But I've seen people walk up with no material too, or they stumble over the first joke. And then all of a sudden people are laughing and they go with it. And you look at them afterwards and you go, my God, you've got something here. I'll tell you a good story about that. I mean, it's part of my business. I wasn't doing personal management originally, but I had thought about it when Garvin's had closed and I had moved on to something. And a good friend of mine in Washington, D.C., who was a very well-known, very popular Black comedian, whose stage name was the Fat Doctor, by the way. It was great. And he said, there's this kid who's been working out really young, and you got to see him because I'm telling you, I think you'll like him. So I said, okay. So he gives me the information. I go to see this kid. And he's 19 years old. And I'm like, material is not there. There's nothing funny about the material. But his smile, his persona on stage is just so endearing. It's like you want to hug him. You love the guy. Turns out it's Martin Lawrence. And I started working with Martin. From that point, I managed Martin for 2.5 years. I moved him to Los Angeles. I got his first TV deal. But I always said, it's not the stand-up that's going to make Martin a star. It's that Martin has a persona that will make him a star. And I knew it. And I called him once. I introduced him once at a show he did, a small show here. And I said, I want to introduce you to who I believe will be the next Eddie Murphy. And to this day, I knew I called it right. I called it right. Again, you see it in somebody. We saw it here in Dave Chappelle, because there was always something about Chappelle all the way back to when he was 15 or 16 that was just, this guy's funny. He's legitimately funny.
So let's talk about, because I was both a personal appearance agent and a manager, maybe 1 or 2 comedians, but I was also a manager for actors, actresses, and things like that. Tell me in your words, the difference in the roles that an agent plays with a comedian and a manager plays with a comedian.
Well, first, I may have difficulty using my own words because most of the ones I know are from the Webster's dictionary. So if you don't mind, I'll use Merriam-Webster's words, if that's all right. Okay. Anyway, well, it's funny because the first thing, somebody's been on stage for 6 weeks and they come and they go, I need a manager. No, it's a little early. I know what you want. You want somebody to make calls and get you work. The difference between a manager and an agent is the agent is the salesman, for lack of a better way of putting it. The agent represents you and others, but they will find you the work. They will negotiate the contracts, make the deal for you for personal appearance or television or something literary or whatever it is.
And it might be 3 or 4 different agents.
Oh, and that most people do.
Yeah.
Right. Most people have in fact, I've always told people, I said, when you hear about this percentage going to this person or that, it's funny. You've got a publicist. Most professionals have a publicist, which is for a comedian who's just breaking through and is really going to do something. That's imperative. You've got to have a good publicist because, unless your manager is really good at that, and some are. And then you've got sometimes a business manager, like in Martin Lawrence's case, he had no financial acumen. I mean, even to the point where he couldn't write a check. 20 years old, he had never done that. So, we had to teach him, he wanted, when we moved out to Los Angeles, again, somebody I'll get killed for later, but when we moved into his first apartment in Los Angeles, he said, well, I got to move someplace where it's walking distance to a place where I can get mail orders. I mean, money orders, because I've got to do money orders. Because he didn't know how to do a check. So he said, well, no, you don't pay your bills with money orders. We're going to set up a checking account. But he had no idea. And again, it's because, you know, of living in a you know, a middle to lower income area of Maryland. But that has nothing to do with it. So many people don't know that skill. So at some point, depending on how good you are with your own money, you know, you have a business manager, you have a manager, you have an agent. I mean, so by the time people finish, you know, when you hear these huge figures that people make for contracts and you go, oh, they must be living great. And then you go, wait a minute, there's a lot of people on that payroll. And I also explain it this way to people because they go, is it fair for someone to lose that much of their income? I said, you know, if you own a store, if you're a businessman and you own a store, you have to pay a store manager. You have to pay the salespeople. You have to pay the stock guy. You have to pay the cashiers. I mean, and that's what it is. You're running a business. You're an artist, but somebody has to run it. Now, if you want to put all of your time into your art, then you need someone to run your business. That's the manager, not the agent. The manager is the one who hires those people, picks the agents, picks the publicists. Okay, obviously you have approval, but they're the ones, I always say, that run your store. And it's the easiest explanation I can give. You're the store. The manager runs your store. They run your staff. You don't have to worry about it. You need to talk to one person. That's the manager. Of course, you'll talk to your agents. Of course, you'll talk to other people. But, you know, it's all coordinated through a manager. It's your central point of coordination. With an agent, it's doing their specific role, their specific job in securing the work.
I think that's a perfect explanation. The other thing that was always a topic of conversation was, you know, 10% to the agent, 15% to the manager. Maybe it was 5% to the publicist. I don't quite remember.
Yeah, so business manager is usually about 5. Yeah, so yeah, right, yeah.
So then it was the accountant, right? The show business accountant and the show business lawyer. Now, some people would say, geez, I'm up over 50% now. But guess what? The guys that are going to get you the biggest deals are that show business lawyer, that show business accountant that represents everybody, the show business lawyer that represents everybody. Those are the guys that are going to talk to your manager and say, look, Spielberg is, I know, and that's it. So they overlook that sometimes.
I mean, this business is all connections. It's all who you know. I mean, and everybody says, I mean, there's, you know, the difference between someone who's got enormous talent and doesn't make it and someone who's got marginal talent and makes it is a phone call that somebody made somewhere along the line.
Right.
I mean, and you can almost use the Seinfeld show as an example, because that whole, even the concept within the show about nothing, the way they presented, the way the pilot was presented. I mean, there's a lot of realism in that, you know, and you never know. I've always said to people, development deals, I've seen them. I've seen literally holding contracts for artists that I've known, work with, where they can't do anything for a year, but they're making 200 grand. And at the end of the year, they got nothing. You know, it's like, okay, well, you made your 200 grand, they held you, they let the project go, move on to the next thing. But never tell somebody that you've got the series, you got the film, because you don't know, even when you're under contract. And I always say, until you see it on the screen, or until you look at it in the CD rack or whatever, you never know what's going to happen.
You know, when I was sitting around at the Improv, and it's not that I was friends with Jerry, but I think Jerry would know me and know my name. Friends, but we sat around the same table. Bud Robinson, Danny Robinson, Bud Friedman. We all sat around the same table, and I remember talking to the guys about, and it wasn't my idea, maybe even I contributed a little bit because I am an idea person. I remember us all talking about doing a show about comedians, about what happened after they performed. What happened backstage? What was their lives backstage? And we were talking about this in the early to mid 80s. And then it happened on Seinfeld.
Well, it did and it didn't, and I'll tell you why. Because I mean, that was that was not so much backstage. Yes, that was the private life of somebody who's a comedian. But the comedy part of it really never entered into it very much. It did, again, with the shows dealing with comedy, or, oh, I'm going to be on this show or that show. But it was really more interpersonal relationships between the comedian and his friends. I think it would be interesting to actually follow, comedians. I used to love I still do, love the opening scene in Broadway Danny Rose, where they're all sitting around the deli and talking, because let's face it, after every comedy show, there was always the clatch that went to the green kitchen in New York. If you're right next to Catch, or you went over to any number of little places. I mean, everybody had a place, and in New York, it was always one of the big delis, and you'd hang out, and you talk till 4 a.m, and ideas, material that was created in those sessions. I don't think people would eat and write. It was,
those yellow legal pads, those long,
yeah,
with the pens. It was
or Bill Maher used to have a pearl quarter, and it was kind of funny because you would be talking and Bill would go, whoa, 1 second. And he would record the thought and put it back in his pocket, which was great too, because you didn't have to struggle for anything. But I mean, those are time. The idea is correct, and I think what Jerry did, I mean, the concept of what they did was a good one. I mean, it was a good one. But again, that show was based way more on those weird, quirky interpersonal relationships, and New York, and being in New York, and than it did specifically with him having to be a comedian. So
you remember the early shows when Jerry would do stand up on stage.
yeah.
So I think Barry had a lot to do with that, not knowing 100%, but I heard Barry's voice in Jerry's jokes when he was on stage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's the same. I mean, if you look at some of the producers that Jerry had over the years, and you look at some of the stories, I mean, and I know that so many of the stories were real. Yes, they wrote them into a script, but there was do you remember Bob Shaw?
I don't particularly remember Bob.
Okay, Bob was a great comic back in the 70s and 80s. Oh, I mean, hysterical. He's the first comic I ever saw make Johnny Carson laugh so hard that he couldn't get into a commercial. I mean, he couldn't catch his breath.
Wow.
But Bob was just one of those incredible people, great writer. And he worked on the Seinfeld show, and I think he was one of the producers for 1 or 2 seasons. But he also, I mean, there were stories about Bob's life. Bob was bald, and one of the stories had to do with a hair restoration treatment from China, and that was happening. That was real. So, they all incorporated themselves in there a lot. Larry David did, of course, and but I mean, they had Marjorie Gross, they had John Heyman, they had Bill Masters, they had Carol, of course, Carol. I mean, and you mentioned somebody as far as friendships go. Carol Leifer was one of the earliest close friendships we had from Washington, because she had married one of the DC comics named Rich Scheidner. This goes back to,
sure.
And we used to go up to New York and stay in their apartment with them all the time. So we would stay with down in the Village with Carol and Rich, and we had some crazy times. And some of the stories, I mean, they used to have parties in their place too, and just some of those times were amazing. I mean, I've got stories I probably can't repeat in public.
Sure you can.
Yeah, but I'll tell you, I just don't want to go to jail. But oh yes, some things that went on during that time, amazing, really amazing. It was a creative period. And not referring specifically to drug use, of course, but I go back to that period in the late 70s and early 80s when a lot of the younger comedians too, there was a lot of cocaine, as you know, and a lot of alcohol abuse. And, a lot of that, not for good, of course, but a lot of it fueled some odd creativity that happened back in that period of time. I think that was responsible for some of the abstract brilliance of Saturday Night Live in the mid 70s. Again, not forgiving or excusing what happened, but because it destroyed a lot of lives. But you had, I mean, who would have thought of land sharks? I mean, who would have thought, I mean, just, somebody's been up 24 hours and they're just at that point spouting these weird, and then they come to life on stage and we go, oh my God, that's brilliant. The samurai character. And you could not do that today, because if you did it today, it would be politically incorrect. You'd be making fun of a ethnic stereotype. But you go back to those sketches, there was nothing funnier than Belushi as the samurai dry cleaner, the samurai delicatessen. that was a brilliance that they had then that has been really hard to reproduce, primarily because I think we've, in recent years, had a tool taken away from us. And what I mean by that is, I think, and I say us, I'm referring to comedians and the comedy business in general, that we've been, we no longer can say what's funny or what we find. We're not trying to insult or hurt anybody. It's not a joke at someone's expense. I mean, I'm Jewish. I love Jewish jokes. The typical stereotypical Jewish joke, they're funny. We know where they came from. You can make fun of things like that and you can have a blast. We all have become, not all of us, I'm just saying that society, I think, has become a little too sensitive and they want to be a victim. And I don't know why, but I think we're now beginning to take away that tool. I mean, what did I just hear the other day? One of the cartoon shows is going to have, it was the Muppets is now going to have a warning at the beginning of the show. This is the truth. Because it will be warning the racially insensitive material and ethnic characters portrayed on the show. What are we doing?
Oh my God.
And I think for comedians, and I say this, I mean, you've heard Mel Brooks say it, today will never be as funny as it was in the 70s because we were free, comedians were free, people were free to do what was funny and we could take risks. But we didn't do it to insult anybody. We didn't do it to hurt anybody. Nobody did it for that reason. You did it because we all found it funny. We could laugh at each other. We could laugh at ourselves. We no longer have that. And
no one's laughing at themselves, and it's way too sensitive a time. I hope that there's a shift. I hope things shift and we get into kinder, sweeter times. And I personally think that that's going to happen.
I mean, I think the creative mind needs to be allowed to work, because if we start hamstringing, I'm just thinking there almost every word in the English language could be misconstrued. Everything has either a xenophobic or racial undertone, and it doesn't, but people want to make it that way. And if you allow yourself to go on that way, you'll take the humor out, you'll take the ability to have humor out of everything. And my coping system, I don't know about yours, but my coping system through work and through life has always been humor. If I can find something to laugh at, again, not to hurt someone but if I can find someone to laugh at, or in politics, something to laugh at, then I'd rather laugh than cry.
Yeah.
And knowing that there's trouble ahead and there's trouble behind, you've got to find a way to cope. And humor is a good way to do it, because the endorphins that we release make us feel happier, make us lighter people. And that's what we need. We need to be able to smile at each other and to smile at things and not take it personally when some things are talked about.
Comedy is going to make a comeback because it's going to be needed more than anything. Throwing out 2020, tell me about Jeff Penn in the last few years. What he was.
Absolutely. I've been, again, I have not been doing management. I've been doing what I would like to call, I've been doing it for a while, artist development, which is something that the A&R, and record companies used to do, artist and repertoire, and it never existed for comedy. I do it, and I've done it with a lot of people, and that is, I don't manage them, but I work with them from, whatever stage they're in order to build them up to a point where they can move on to the next level. In a way, that's what I did with Martin, because we spent time together. I was his quote unquote manager, but we worked more on him and developing him and packaging him than anything else. So yes, it was management, but it was to move him to another level. And I do that now. Doing that with a couple of DC artists, and I'm working with a guy named Neil Griffin out of Ohio, who another Black comedian who has a lot of potential, great character. And that's the thing. It's not the material, it's the character, and that I love. I also produce, and I've been producing associate producing events, live events, not all comedy. I do in Washington, D.C. I worked in the talent department for 9 years for the National Memorial Day concert and the July 4th concert on the Mall. I worked with the talent on that. I've worked for 18 years with the Mark Twain Prize at the Kennedy Center, which is comedy, of course. And that's been one of the biggest thrills of my life, because not only have I worked with great people, met great people, but just the team around it. And it's just such a Such a great group, now, and we that was they changed producers a couple of years ago, so it's a different group right now. I'm hoping to get back involved, but we'll see on that one. And there's a lot of other shows like I worked on the Obama inaugural concert in 2009, which was again one of the most fun things I've ever done.
I was
You
just
know,
going to ask. I was just going to ask. The way I end the show many times is really what was the most fun, exciting. Maybe you just said it. Let's not talk about that then. What do you remember in your career? As like, man, this is apex, man. This is incredible.
well, this may sound cliche, and I say this, I mean, I've met so many really neat people over the years, idols, and it's not just shaking a hand, but when you find yourself sitting somewhere and having a conversation, and then you go later, oh my God, that was Springsteen, or that was whatever, you go, wow, there's nothing like that. But it just the next day you wake up like everybody else, and I can't say there's an apex. I mean, I want to. The apex is the career itself. It's the ability to have been able to work with some of the funniest people, most talented people, on camera, off camera, on stage, off stage, in a business that truly exists to make people happy, to make people laugh, to make people feel good. I can't think of a better place for me, and I can't think of anything more exciting than getting up in the morning and saying, referring back to something you said earlier, that I'm respected enough by comedians and other booking people and agencies, managers, whatever, because I've always worked for a fair deal for everybody. And in everything I've done, I make sure that everyone's happy. And it's not about how much money I make. It's about the end of the day when everybody goes home and says, that was one of the best gigs I've ever done, or that's one of the best experiences I've ever had. So the apex for me is every night when something like that happens. And I know that I'm going to, hear from comedians, thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm going to hear from, executive producers, thank you. We couldn't have done it without you. That's the apex. The apex is knowing that I've done the job, that I kind of created a niche for myself as times changed. Obviously, this last year is more of a nick than a niche. But I will say this: I will say you're not only correct about comedy making a comeback and being stronger than ever, but I think I think the industry has culled a little bit. I mean, a lot of people may have dropped out. The people that come back are going to be the strongest, both in the business and on stage. And I think that people are going to be flooding to comedy clubs and to theaters because they want this. They need it. They've missed it for a year. It's going to be a year and a half. And it's not going to be about who's on stage as much as it is that it's comedy and we want to laugh again. So I think that's where we're at.
Just last weekend, Dice was at a theater right in my neighborhood. I hardly knew about it, and I didn't know about it on time. And just today, I went down to look at this theater that's turned into not a comedy club, but a comedy theater, which I
Right.
think
Yeah.
is going to be the future. It's not going to be 50 seaters or 70 or 80 seaters, but, a couple hundred seats and right on top of the stage. And I went down there and looked at this place and I was like, wow, look at this. This is
Well,
a perfect place for
I've been trying to, over the last 10 years or so, open something like that in this area. We have a very successful improv in the city of DC. I'm trying to open something in Maryland, and we had without going through the pros and cons, we had a great location, and it's exactly what you're talking about. It just has too many issues, and mostly, with property values and things like that. But it's a theater, and it's an old Art Deco theater, and you know what? That's what you need. You need something. It can be 300, 400, 500 seats.
right,
It's
right.
all fine. And it's still nice to have the nightclub, the tables and chairs, as opposed to theater seating. But yes, the big room and the big stage is where it's at, and I
Right.
think that's what people are going to gravitate towards. And also, hopefully, they will gravitate towards the better. Again, I'm hoping that that's what's left anyway: the better acts and the
Exactly.
better actors. And as a club owner, I will say this, and you may appreciate this, having been a personal appearance agent. But when we had all the way back to Garvin's, when we had competition opening in town, and I used to say this, I'm not competing with Dan down the street. I want him to have the best show he can possibly have, and fill that room, because if people have a good time there, then they may come over to see me. If they have a lousy time there, they may look at what we're doing and say, oh, it's probably the same thing. So to me, the best competition you can have is good competition, because it makes the industry, it strengthens the industry, and it strengthens the art. So, I hope more people will work together again, as we come together in the next few years to almost rebuild the comedy industry into something bigger and better than than there ever was before.
And listen, you have such a great attitude and a great outlook. I'm sure you and I are going to be doing something together here real soon, and we're going to have some good discussions. As soon as this show is over,
I
and see
I
how we
would love. Oh yeah,
work
absolutely. Yeah.
together to make something bigger and better. But I have to tell you, Jeff, I don't think anyone could have done a better job of filling in what goes on behind the scenes with an agent, with a manager, with a booker, with a producer. This is exactly what I wanted from you in this show. And you came through, man. This was
Well,
spectacular.
thank you. I
I
appreciate
couldn't
it.
have gotten more and better information about the 80s than from somebody like you. And now I know why you're on everybody's Facebook. Now I understand why.
Well, at least I'm on everybody's Facebook because they like me. That's
Right. Exactly.
I mean,
Exactly.
it's been a long time, and again, even with Seinfeld, and I've run into Jerry. We were never close friends, but I've run into him. He knows me, and he acknowledges. We can joke a little bit, and that's what's great. It's what's great about this business is you can be away from somebody for 20 years, but we were together and so close together back then in the 80's that everybody from that period knows everyone else, and it's like a class reunion. Always is.
It was magic. So I want to thank you so much for doing the show.
Well,
And
thank you.
like I said, you filled in some areas here in the 80s golden age of comedy that a comedian couldn't have done it. This is what I wanted. So I appreciate you hitting a grand slam on this show.
Thank you very much. And you were hitting a grand slam on the show too, because it's the perfect topic. It really is. I'm excited, and to see old friends like Murray Langston. I mean, that's just going to be. This is going to be classic. Yes.
So I just did a show with him the other day.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I just listed it today, and I'm still having trouble breathing, recovering from him having me in stitches for a whole show.
And he's got a great book out, by the way, too. So that's yeah, yeah. I mean, he's talking about somebody who's been in every facet of this business for so many years. Just great stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, Jeff. God bless, and
Thank you.
thanks for being on another edition of the 80s golden age of comedy. Bye bye, everybody. We'll see you all again. Take care now.